Hello, everyone. Welcome to our latest AMA with Brad. We're going to be taking a few minutes here to let folks stream in. Thank you for joining bright and early. Howdy, Michelle. You win first chat. Big award. And yeah, people can start introducing themselves. We'll put on the classic music here. This app only gives you the option to do a few different songs, so we always end up with the same little tune.
You just have to start using it in all of your explainer videos now.
Yeah, exactly. It is pretty catchy.
The official rally song.
Yes. Lauren, you got a Utah here.
Woohoo! Don't see many of them.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone who's just coming in. We'll get started in a few minutes.
So it looks like Michelle and I are basically neighbors.
Yes. Amazing. Awesome. We'll just get started in 2 minutes. Yeah, I think it's like a 20-second tune or something that just loops.
Yeah, I saw the little the player in the upper corner. For those of us that have host controls, everyone else obviously doesn't see this. Like, oh, there's a little time.
Oh, there's the whole thing.
Yeah, check that out. But
Wow.
It's maybe 30 seconds.
Yeah, it's great. All right, still have a few last minute joiners. Why don't we get started? I'll pause the amazing music. Cool. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I think this is our 8th, 9th AMA, something like that. So appreciate all of you who are repeat joiners. And we have a very special guest today, Brad Orego. We'll learn a lot from their experience as a research ops leader and research leader throughout their career. But just to start with a few kind of round rules, instructions on what to expect here today. I will start the conversation and moderate for about 20 minutes or so with some pre-prepared questions. Appreciate all of you who sent questions in advance. And then after that, we'll move into Q&A. where Brad will take your questions live, hence the AMA. So we will be taking questions directly from the chat. Don't feel the need to save them until the Q&A section. Start adding them in there, and we'll kind of keep a log on our side. And yeah, anytime you see a question there that you really like, feel free to upvote it, and we'll try taking the most upvoted questions. But we'll likely have a chance to get through a lot of them since we have almost a full hour today. So thanks again all for joining. And for those that I haven't met yet, my name is Oren. I am one of the co-founders and CEO here at Rally. We are not just an AMA company, we also are building what we're calling a user research CRM as a single source of truth for participant management and recruitment of your own actual users. So if you're interested in learning more, we'll pop a link into our website down here, and we'll share that with you as well towards the end of the call. And I'm joined here with Lauren, who heads up content marketing for us. So you'll be receiving a recap from her as well after the event. And last but not least, Brad, if you'd like to give a quick intro on yourself.
Yeah. So hi everyone. For those that I haven't met yet, my name is Brad. I live here in Brooklyn, New York. I'm from Buffalo, New York originally. I've been in the UX. It's funny when people are like, how'd you get into UX? What's your whole story? I love telling this story because for me, when I was 16, 17 years old and trying to figure out where I wanted to go to college and what I wanted to study, at that point I decided I want to understand people better and I want to make video games. So from that, decided like psychology and computer science, I'll find somewhere that I can double major. Wound up going to the University of Rochester because they were pretty much the only school that was like, yeah, just come here and study both, right? Most schools are like, these are very, very different things. Not entirely sure how you would put computer science and psychology together. What does that look like? And I'm at Rochester. I'm studying for a few years. We have a professor who's a researcher at the Kodak lab in Rochester at the time, come in and teach this like intro to HCI, intro to human computer interaction course. And I just remember like reading the description and then looking at the title and then signing up and then stomping into my advisor's office saying like, why did nobody tell me that human computer interaction is a thing? So this is 2008, 2009. There wasn't, not to say there was no such thing as HCI or UX, that people weren't doing this, but it just wasn't as prevalent. If we look at usability engineering, sort of the first textbook in HCI, that was published in 1993, which means we're 10-ish years out of that when I discover HCI as an undergrad. So fundamentally changed my entire career path. Obviously I was going to be sort of an AI or an ML engineer. I was thinking like brain stuff, engineering, I can write some code. That was the path that I was on. And I discover HCI, discover UX, and just do this complete, like, this is what I meant to be and it meant to do. So it's interesting to, now to think back and say like, wow, I guess I've been in this field for 15 years ish, which is kind of insane to think about, because not to say again that there wasn't UX when I graduated and started working, but my first handful of jobs, basically something out there, like somebody told, some startup advisor or someone on their board said, hey, you need to hire a UX person. So this startup would hire me and say, do UX-y stuff. Like I had no guidance. I had no, mentorship or management or anything. They were just like, we don't know, go figure it out. So it's been really interesting to like see the entire industry evolve. Obviously for me to figure out, my path. Certainly didn't start off just doing research. That's just sort of where I gravitated to, having the background in human subjects research and psychology and all that. But it's really funny to every now and then be working with one of my colleagues in design or in engineering, and I like will say or do something that they're like, wait, why do you know that? Like, what do you? Aren't you just the researcher? It's like, well, no, I also have. I can write JavaScript. I like know how to do software engineering, and I've done some design work. So yeah, it's pretty fun.
Wonderful. Yeah, very unique background and experience, and a big focus of the conversation today is all about elevating the role of research and elevating the topic of research, the impact that research can drive within an organization. And from our conversation, obviously a lot of that starts with relationships. So why don't you maybe give us an overview of how you believe researchers can build a more meaningful and strategic relationship with their design and product counterparts and everyone else that research ends up interacting with in the organization?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's obviously a very timely and relevant question. If we think about why did I even, I've spent 10, 15 years in the industry, worked at a bunch of different companies. Auth0 in particular is where I spent the last 3 years. I got acquired by Okta, so became, part of that organization. But, I joined that company kind of with a hypothesis, right? Which is like, what happens if we build our team operations first? What happens if we essentially ignore doing research for a year and focus on operations? And I think that setting that stage in that way really it sets a completely different relationship up with all of these partners, because traditionally what happens is that someone in product or someone in design does some work for a while and they go, we should hire a researcher, right? Like, we're doing enough of this ourselves. Let's get someone dedicated to do this. And when that's the context that you step into, like, you are automatically sort of like part of this organization, part of this team, and you're just like you're not to say pigeonholed, but you are kind of like slotted into this product team, this function. Whereas, the relationship that I crafted from the start was like, hey, we're going to do things a little bit differently than you've probably seen in other companies. We're going to, we set up the context and the nature of the relationship differently. So, one of the things that we saw both with our designers and with our researchers at Auth0 is that, our partners in product would come to us as leadership and say, we really want people to push back here. We really want PMs know that they don't know everything, right? So you may think that they think they know everything, but at the end of the day, they want to gather as much information as they can to make the right decisions, right? And they're not experts in engineering, they're not experts in design, they're not really experts in anything. I'm sure someone in the product world will give me some flack for that, but it's kind of their job to take a bunch of disparate things, make a decision with incomplete data, and then figure out how to go forward with that. So it's kind of easy to say, but like, you have to push back a little bit, right? You can't just do what they ask us to do. We'll later talk a bit about like the state of the industry. I think a lot of where we are right now is because researchers across the board haven't been pushing back and haven't been asking why, and haven't been sort of, instead of being a partner, they're sort of being they're being subservient to product. So I think that's part of it. And the other thing is, you can't, there's a balance there, right? Because if you ask why to every single question, eventually it gets pedantic and they stop, involving in the conversation. You need to understand their world as well, right? I'm always pushing my team to talk with talk to your PM and ask them like, hey, why are we doing this, right? What's the long-term vision? Where do we fit in to the industry as opposed to our competitors? Like, we're building this thing right now, but what's happening 12 months from now, right? Because that context, understanding, the entire picture is going to make those conversations easier, but it's also going to make you a better researcher, because at the end of the day, they know they need research, but they don't necessarily know what research they need.
Awesome. Super helpful. And May is actually asking a question here that I think is quite relevant for where we are right now, so we can just pop into it. She's asking, how did you go about setting up this different type of relationship and foundational point for researchers in your past company? And if you can share any specific examples and how you ended up building this culture of questioning the why behind the research that people are asked to do.
Yeah, so I think the relationship thing, I approached it sort of top down and bottom up, right? So you have to make sure that everyone in leadership's on the same page, right? You need to make sure that the leadership chain knows that, hey, we're not just going to do what you're asking us to do, because it's our job not to just do what you tell us, but to actually deliver the right insights, the right intelligence, give you the information that you need to make the decision. And you hired me for a reason, right? That was always kind of the line I would come back to. It's like, somebody in this organization recognized the need for research leadership. So that's why I'm here. I'm here to tell you, what we need to do and what we don't need to do. It's maybe easier for me at this point in my career and the position I was in to set that up and basically say, hey, we're not going to do we're not just going to do what you tell me to do. We're not going to do what you ask us to do. Like, we're going to work with you. If you say, hey, here's some questions we have, here's a blind spot in our roadmap, great. I want to have those conversations. I don't want you to come to me and say, we need to do some usability testing on this audience. Like that's just not what we're here for. So that's the top down approach. Like, make sure leadership's on the same page. The bottom up is actually much more about understanding, right? Most folks, when you get to a certain point in your career, know what research is or think you know what research is and have a decent idea of what that means. But if you're, a PM and you've got your 5 engineers and your designer and you're trying to manage all these different resources and all these different timelines, and I say, hey, here's another thing you need to consider. Here's another thing you need to do. The first reaction is just like, oh, we don't have time. Like, there's too much going on. So there's a lot of education, a lot of evangelization, a lot of helping them understand where research fits in and how it's not just a thing you do at the beginning. It's not just a thing you do at the end. Like, it's this along the way. Here's the type of research you do in this phase. Here's the type you do over here. Here's the stuff you do in the middle. Like, really helping people understand what that looks like. So, I mean, I think concrete examples. We at Auth0 every single month do what we call, or did, because I'm no longer there. I hope they still do it. That's a good question. But we do this thing called a research deep dive, where quite literally it's a 45-minute lecture demonstration with time for QA. We just pick a topic in research. We look at what are some of the questions we've been getting, as a research function and our research ops team, at track, like, oh, people are asking lots of questions about survey design. Maybe we should talk about that. Oh, we're having a lot of trouble with people, converting their insights into nuggets to go into the insights repo. Great, that's a topic we should talk about. We don't have there's not a hot button topic right now. Let's talk about sampling bias. Let's pull something else, from the research sort of the literature, like from the academic side of it. So we do things like that where every single month, and now anytime anyone joins the company, we heard this a lot. We get a PM or a designer that would join our team, join Auth0, and we would just we'd say, hey, here's this entire library of past videos we've done. Here's all the documentation. And folks are like, this is basically a college level course in how to do UX research. So yeah, I think hopefully that answers the question, but
yeah,
it's a lot of that. It's a lot of getting the right context, making sure. It's a mistake we actually made at the beginning, is we only started top down. I was like, of course, leadership's on board, let's go do it. And then we started getting a lot of questions from the PMs and designers that were just like, what is this and why and how? So we sort of spent more time and more of our resources and whatnot doing that, bringing people along with us, right? Instead of just saying, here's a new thing, good luck, bring folks along with you.
Yeah, no, I think that's fantastic. Working all possible angles, and I'm sure that kind of research deep dive concept can be very broadly applicable to other organizations. What were you seeing as some of the maybe positive impacts from that effort that you might not have seen otherwise if you didn't have that resource that you built?
So we started doing them because we were just it's like, if you hear yourself repeat the same thing over and over, there's this concept in software engineering, keep it dry, don't repeat yourself, which in that context means if you write a certain piece of code and then you have to write it again and again, it's like, no, just make that a separate function and then call that function. So we were doing the same thing. We were like, okay, what are the questions we keep having to answer? What are the topics that anytime someone joins the company, what's the onboarding process, and how much of that can we document and automate and get that stuff out of the way? So it's interesting because there's sort of a balance there, because you don't want it just to be like, here's a wall of text, good luck. There is still that human aspect to it. So typically the way this would work is that someone would ask us a question, join the company, whatever, and set up an intro meeting, and I would say, great, make sure you go through our onboarding course, because we have every single person that joined Auth0, depending on what their role is, got one of 2 different research onboarding courses assigned to them. So we're like, have you done the onboarding thing yet? No. do that first, because that's going to answer 80% of your questions. Then you can bring me the last 20% that are, interesting and relevant and more specific. And same thing with like, we need to do a card sort. I'm like, great, watch this first, then we can talk, because then we have, sort of a base level of understanding, versus having to every single time be like, all right, here's what a card sort is. Here's, you can do an open sort or a closed sort, going through all the basics. It's like, just give them all that information up front, let them, digest it and go through it on their own time. But then that really sets the context. And
Awesome. Very, very helpful. Sounds like it's a big efficiency driver. Makes everyone's lives a lot easier. Cool. Well, a big topic that I know comes up a lot in the world of research, especially as we think about elevating the practice, is on demonstrating and tracking ROI. Because this is also how our stakeholders, your stakeholders think and how they measure things. So how have you thought about this process and how have you operationalized it in your past?
So I think the first thing for me when it comes to ROI is there's basically two ways to track it. One, like, are you tracking internal things or external things? Internal things are basically cycle time, right? Some people, I've seen this in a few companies, and I kind of don't get it. I've done this myself, where it's like, we completed 70 studies this year. Like, okay, great. What does that mean? Like, what, at the end of the day, like, we've done it. It's kind of cool to look at the increase in volume over time. Tremendous did a case study where like Auth0 8x their research. I'm like, we quite literally went from, I think 4 studies to like 32 or something like that in the course of a year, which is impressive in its own right. But is that actually driving the income, the outcome, and the impact that you want to have? Because really, you could do one study, but if it completely changes the roadmap and the order in which, and even the things that are on the roadmap, like, that one study is worth more than 10 separate other ones. So you can look at the amount of research that's happening. You can look at the number of customers you're talking to. These are all sort of internal metrics that are maybe important to track. And then there's, of course, the external stuff. It's one of the external ones. You may think this is internal, but it's not. How many people at the company are using your resources? How many people are using the Insights repo? How many people are showing up to your presentations? How many people, where, like, we actually would look at where are the requests coming from? Because, we had an intake process, and we're like, oh, so we're getting a bunch from these teams in product, we're getting some from marketing, we're getting some from customer success. Like, that's an interesting way to track, like, what impact are you having? What's the sort of scope that you as a function are covering and supporting? Also useful when we start talking about budgeting, because you're like, hey, 15% of our requests are coming from marketing, 0% of our budget's coming from marketing. So I think, but like, external is also, a lot of people and companies will think of research as like, we're trying to improve the product, right? We're trying to increase our conversion rate or decrease the number of errors or whatever it may be. Like, that's sort of like old school classic UX, right? Usability engineering, the sort of foundation of HCI, is all of that. Like, I think one of the Reckoning articles called it micro research, which is like, you're really trying to optimize button placement, and you're looking at Fitts law and things like that, right? Like, you're really homing in on the interaction part of it, and like making that a science. Usability engineering, that's a very different approach than saying like, hey, I love when we had to do this. How do you measure like the impact of a marketing campaign? Like, how do you measure brand awareness and brand sentiment? Like, that's actually pretty hard to do. But those are sometimes the questions that we're asked, to tackle as researchers. So the first question is like, which of the two things does your business care more about? Do they care more about the external things where you're really trying to drive the product forward and you need to find a good way to measure and track and show improvement in whatever, key performance indicators or other KPIs your company cares about? Or are they like, yeah, product stuff, we've got another team handling that. We actually care more about decreasing the cycle time. Like, we, through the reports and whatnot that we had both at 1010 data before 1010 back there, 1010 and Auth0, we would see anywhere from 10 to 20% decrease in the amount of cycle time, the delivery time for engineering and design tickets. So it's like, if you got a team of 5 people and it takes them, 4 weeks to do something instead of 5 weeks, like that's a few hundred hours of saved labor, and it took you 50 hours to do that research study, right? Like when we talk about ROI, you can actually walk into budget conversations and say, great, what's our headcount for engineering this year? I can save you 15% of that if you give me these resources.
Love it. Love it. Well, we have a few questions that came in from the audience before we move into our next theme on the evolution of research in this industry. But maybe you can quickly do a crowd pleaser and talk about how you use your coding background in your research practice. I think
I saw that question pop up. People have asked me like, okay, why do you care so much about research? For me, it's like, well, research is a way to, be more efficient, because how many times like has a product gone out, no one cares about it, it doesn't work, right? Then you have to go back and do a bunch of rework. I've seen this happen throughout my career. And that just seems like a waste of not only like money and all that, but like time, like people's time, right? Like you and I and everyone else has to work on this stuff. So let's make sure we're working on the right thing. I've had people ask, like, why did you go into research operations? Like, why do you care so much about this? And it's again, like, if research is about saving time, research ops is about saving researchers time and making them more efficient. That's a very engineering focused mindset, right? Like that is, I studied computer science. I like have this very different way of thinking about pretty much everything. So really research ops, when it like was birthed from the industry a few years ago and became like a formalized thing, I just immediately like jumped on board and was like, oh yeah, this is just applying engineering concepts to research. This is looking at our entire research process, finding the places that are inefficient and making that more efficient. That's another way why, like we were talking, going back to ROI, your operations function should keep track of like the key points in your research journey to figure out where's the biggest slowdown. Is it recruiting? Is it incentives? Is it scheduling? Whatever it may be, right? Like figure that out, because that's going to help you justify spending time to fix it. So like, it's a very engineering centric approach. Something that we did a lot of at Auth0, and like Rodrigo is our research ops lead, was essential in this, is automation. He actually wrote a whole blog post about it that went on the research ops blog, where it's just like, this is how you can increase your impact as a research ops function by automating a bunch of stuff. And guess what automation takes? A little bit of coding, right? A little bit of like technical know-how and, Zapier and if this, then that, and whatever. Like you've got to, even if you're not actually writing JavaScript, like you have to have that sort of, process-oriented mindset. So I think it's been pretty essential for me. It's just a very different way of thinking about things.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely sounds like it's come in handy. Wonderful. One other question here from Sean on any suggestions for ways to expand the reach of your research outside of your organization. So I think pointing at something around using research as a method to establish thought leadership in an industry in general, as opposed to just within your own organization.
Yeah, so this is where your partnerships with marketing are really important. This is where your partnerships, we did a lot of like our, I'm blanking on the like analysts relation, right? So like the Gartners, the Forresters, the whatnot. Auth0 was kind of already in a position where people looked to that company as a leader in the space, but by establishing these, like we would get on calls, because we could do like analyst calls every now and then. Our analyst relation person would be like, hey, can you sit in on this call? Because I think the research that you're doing will be super interesting to some of these other people. So if you have those functions, go through that. We do a lot of blogging. The Auth0 design team does a whole bunch of blog writing, where I've written there, my team has written there, our designers have written there, and it's just like, it's a channel that we control ourselves, right? It is completely independent from everything else. Some of those blog posts bubble up to the auth0.com blog. When we launched our research program, that got a blog post on Auth0's main blog and through those channels. I think Stacy's post on accessibility, made it up to so like sometimes some of this content bubbles up as well. We just sort of, based on our position in the industry, figure out what are the like, what are the organizations, what are the professional organizations, the consortiums, the whatevers. Like, we presented to the FIDO Alliance, which is, I don't actually remember what FIDO stands for. Fast something, but it's basically like biometrics, like all the new ways that identity is handled. Like, FIDO's pushing a lot of that forward. And I remember going there and sharing our passkey research, and you got like people from Microsoft, people from Apple, people from Amazon, right? Like, all these big companies, one, attending and looking at and, listening to our presentation. They're like, can you send us the report afterwards? Of course, asking us questions, asking like, oh, that's interesting. Like, what about this? The UX committee at, in the FIDO Alliance was like, we should talk. Like, we want to dig more in on this. So it's building those relationships with other folks in the company. It's, I push my team a lot, like, present at local meetups, right? Go to conferences, pitch your ideas as like, there's call for proposals, like, submit things, right? Like, there's a lot of different avenues, and if nothing else, just write your own blog posts, right? Anyone can put things out on the internet. Be mindful of, is there anything you need to sanitize or redact? Of course, don't publish any trade secrets, but yeah, anyone can go write.
Yeah, I love that. Everything from the small actionable things you can take today and all the way to big picture, higher impact exercises. But that's really great advice. Cool. Michelle is asking a question here. Going back to ROI, any tactical suggestions on how to track research impact on some of your organizational KPIs?
Yeah, this one's tough. And I say this because there's only so much it depends on the size of the company, but there's only so much control you have. So when I joined Auth0 3 years ago, literally the very first conversation I had with our chief product officer, I was like, hey, I've noticed we don't have any analytics in place. We don't have, like, they had just bought Heap. It wasn't even implemented yet. And I was like, we're not tracking any of our funnels, any of our key flows. How do we know what impact the changes we're having are making on not only the experience, but on our bottom line, like on things that we care about, on acquisition and retention? And the response was, we don't. And at that point, it's like, that was probably the moment where I was like, okay, I guess I'm not going to tie our value as a function to increasing conversion or retention or anything like that, because if we can't report on it, I can't show that we're having any value. So it really depends on the situation you're in. If you're at a small enough company, you can be like, hey, let's add Heap or Mixpanel or whatever, right? Like, find the tool that works for you and your organization, convince the engineering team to put it in place. I've been at companies where I've literally put that in place myself. Shout out to having some coding experience, where it's like, oh, just like drop this tag in here, make sure it initializes properly. It's Auth0 is the first company I didn't have any commits to the repo. Like, I usually get like 1 or 2 commits in per company. Yeah, so it's like, it just depends on, but sometimes there isn't an answer there. If they do have analytics in place, awesome. Figure out who owns that, figure out who's configuring it. You should know what are the things that your business cares about. Is it retention? Is it acquisition? Is it something else, right? Like, what are those KPIs that as a business you're tracking? And then, yeah, find out the way to say, okay, so it was here before, we did some stuff, we made some changes, and it's here afterwards. Compare that to, it's always about contrast. It's always about comparing, here's a new feature that we launched that had research, here's one that didn't. What's the difference in performance between these two?
Awesome. So yeah, not simple to do, but tactical advice is always helpful. Cool. Well, why don't we move on to our next theme of the evolution of research within the world of software. So just to kick us off, how have you seen the role of research change in organizations over time, especially in the context of all the recent layoffs that have seemingly impacted pretty much all companies in the space?
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about this when I was like going down the usability engineering route. That's what UX used to be. That's what research used to be. It was just like, is this button in the right place? Are we saving a few milliseconds on every click? That, we sort of moved past that. But then I think we got stuck. Like I think a lot of the layoffs we're seeing is that research really hasn't changed. Research has not evolved, right? We now as a function have been around for 20, 25-ish years, and we're not focusing on across the board. Like obviously my situation is different because I was lucky enough to have the foresight to think like, let's make sure the work we're doing matters. But a lot of folks are just doing work that they're being told to do. They're not thinking critically. They're not asking why. They don't understand the business side of it. Because at the end of the day, like if you want to just do, research and you don't want to learn about business and you don't want to do any of that, go back to academia, right? Like that's great. Certainly we need some of those folks that are a little bit more theory based in the industry, but this is a business at the end of the day. If you just want to do research, there are plenty of nonprofits, there are plenty of other places that would love to have this research talent. It was one of the things that I spent a few years in my career like doing some like IoT, some like smart whatever, because I was like, we really should be applying research to things that aren't just technology. We should be applying these concepts to physical devices, to physical spaces, civic design, right? There's a lot of places you can't go. But I think for the most part, like research, like it's like I said at the beginning, like product or design will hire a researcher and you kind of get stuck in that organization supporting your team, and you're not, I think sort of making a generalization, most researchers don't think, what if we were working with the marketing team? What if we were working with customer success? What if we were working with sales, right? Both at 1010 and at Auth0, our field enablement team, our like sales enablement team, I would go and give presentations to them. I was part of their training. Was like, hey, here's an update from the research team. Here's a new process. Here's the thing. Like being integrated with the sales team is something that I see very few research functions doing.
Yeah. Super helpful to hear. And I think the question that just came in from Nick is highly relevant to your piece on how do you kind of change the dynamic between being more reactive to being more proactive. But essentially, Nick here is asking, what are your thoughts on research advocating for having its own horizontal organization, rather being sister teams to design and product rather than laddering up to them?
Yeah, so this is funny. I'm working on a blog post. I've been reading everyone's like reckoning, posts, and Jared Spool was one that was like, we need a chief research officer, which, obviously lots of respect for Jared and the work that he's done for the rest of us. But he also didn't really say how or like what that looks like. He was just like, do it. I've been saying this since at least since I joined Auth0, where I joined and was like, hey, so how do we move research out of the product org? Because at the end of the day, aside from like the whole pigeonholing thing I just talked about, they control your budget, right? The number of times that I went to our design director, our VP of product, our chief product officer, like I would talk to people and say, hey, we need some research, right? Like we're getting 30 requests per quarter and I have 4 people. Like these numbers just don't work out. And I would get like my VP, very, a lot of respect for Cassio on this. He was like, I hear you, but if our CFO comes to me and says, hey, here's, we've got budget for 10 headcount, what are you going to do with that? And I say, hire researchers. They're going to say, no, we need engineers, right? So there's like a culture change that needs to happen across the board. Part of that is moving research out of product and out of design, because it's going to make it easier for us to work cross-functionally. It's going to make it easier for us to support different parts of the business. And this is, a later question we have of like, we do need a chief research officer because we need someone at that top level that not only understands what we do and what we offer in a deep way, but can have those conversations. I was like, put me in the room with our CFO. I will show you the numbers. I will have that conversation. And this is at a company where they had the ROI thing. They had those reports and still could not win that argument that we need sales and engineering. Like we need to invest in the things that we already have. So it's, I've always been, not a fan of it. And I think we're sort of the industry and the field has matured to a point where we're kind of ready to do that. Something else I think, Oren will segue into is like, okay, how? What does that look like? I just said that Jared said we should do it, but didn't say how. The second conversation I had with our chief product officer and with my VP of product was, yeah, after the we don't have metrics thing, I was like, great, yeah, we need to shuffle things around, because putting research inside of design inside a product doesn't make sense. Like, we need to take the data science team and take our pricing and strategy team and take our growth marketing team and take our competitive intelligence team and smash all these things together into this like centralized intelligence function. The subtext was, and put me in charge of that, but I basically was like, we need to fix this, because all these teams are in different parts of the organization. They're all like, growth marketing is obviously in the marketing team, data science was in engineering at that point, research was in design, competitive intelligence and pricing and strategy were in product. Like, we're just all over the place. We also are like our voice of the consumer team was in customer success. So I formed what we called the CIA, the Customer Intelligence Alliance, but I like formed this little working group from all these different people that I was like, product marketing also was in marketing. So it's like, we need to get all these folks in a room, once a month or so, just to say, what are we all working on? Where are the opportunities for us to work together? Yeah, just like, but that's a thing that I did without any sort of organizational support for that. So that's how you do it, right? You start to build those relationships with folks, you start to have those conversations, and then little by little, you can get multiple people across the board saying the same thing to, your leadership, to everyone else, and say like, hey, yeah, we're kind of losing, we're missing an opportunity here, because we are all being pulled in different directions. The poor data science team at Auth0 was always like being pulled in engineering and like having to support this and having to do these things. And they're over here like, but wait, there's an interesting project over here we could work on. And they just didn't have the bandwidth for it. But that's a completely different picture if you have someone that is, a VP or whatever, that is at the top of your insights team. And that insights team is made up of all these different people. Because yes, of course, we're going to support engineering. Of course, we're going to support marketing. We're going to support customer success. Most of our work will probably still come from product. But at the end of the day, it's going to give you the ability to not only build the team you need, but to say no to things. I was lucky enough to carve out basically 20 to 25% of our capacity to do projects that I thought were interesting, right? Like the passkey thing that we did some biometric research, like all on this like end user facing research, because no one else was doing it. And for us as a company that was like, we are the leader in identity and access management, like we need to understand not only how tech workers interact with software, but how does the general public do it? Because if we say we process 4 billion logins per month, like that means a lot of people that are, I always go back to like my mom or like your grandma, like people are using this technology that are not us, that are not people that interact with tech every single day.
Awesome. Yeah, covered a lot of topics there, but I'm glad we started getting into it. And yeah, I guess you kind of pointed to the need for research representation in senior leadership, the process of going about it through building partnerships. But why don't we go even deeper on it and just talk about the chief research officer or chief insights officer role? What's your vision for this type of role, and how can it kind of elevate the practice of research in general?
Yeah, so I talked about this a little bit. Right now, in your organization, who is advocating for research at the executive level? If you're having a conversation with the C-suite and with your board of directors, who there is like, hey, we could do some research on this? Is it marketing? Is it product? Do you have a chief design officer? Probably not. Sometimes there are research functions that are in the engineering org. Like, who up there is saying like, yeah, research, let's talk about research. Like, I was, again, lucky enough, like had a really, really good relationship with our chief product officer and with my VP of product, where like they would have those conversations, but they just don't have the nuanced understanding of what we can do, and the value we can deliver. So until we get someone at that level, and until we really start speaking the language of business, I sort of mentioned this a bit earlier, we're not going to get proper representation. Organizations are not really going to understand what we do, and they're going to continue to suffer. So, they're not thinking about opportunities where research can get involved because they don't really know the full breadth of our capability. They're not looking at the ROI of research because most of the time we don't give it to them. So if we're having a budget conversation, they're not armed with the things that they need to have those conversations. They don't really understand the breadth of scope you can work on because they kind of only understand research in the context of their own organization. If you're a researcher in the marketing team, guess what? They're focusing on, growth. They're focusing on acquisition. They don't understand that you could also improve the customer, support experience because they just know you as like, oh, we need to do some A/B testing and, figure out why people are dropping out of our conversion funnel, right? So you need, like, we need to start to have those conversations, and it starts with like your research leader, whoever, like wherever you are in the organization, you need to start to educate up. You need to start to manage up. You need to start to talk to your director, talk to your VP, make sure they understand what you do and how you do it. They're armed with the data they need to walk into these conversations. Like, how many researchers think about, giving your VP some data to go have a budget conversation? Like, not very many. And honestly, not very many research leaders, because guess what? Most research leaders, like, this is the way that most research teams are formed. Somebody says we need to hire a researcher. They hire a researcher. That researcher does good research. They say, great, go hire more. And then that person is suddenly a manager. Do they really want to be a manager? Maybe not, right? Have they gone through the proper, training? And like, being a research manager and a research leader is fundamentally different than being a researcher. We still know how to do research. Like, don't let that fool you. But people, like, I think someone on Learners was like, what is it like to be a director of research? It's like, I'm in spreadsheets all day. I'm looking at budget. I'm managing our expenses. Like, I'm doing career planning for people. Like, those aren't research skills. Those are management skills. And I think we, sort of need to come to terms with the fact that a lot of research leaders and a lot of research managers have not been doing the greatest job like, they're great at working with their team, but they're probably not doing that managing up part of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess on that piece, any advice or recommendations for research leaders that are here today that are maybe wanting to upskill in these areas, learn how to better drive that kind of impact internally?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any like courses or books or anything like that to read.
Mm-hmm.
I think my experience has been, I sort of grew up as the industry grew up, so I learned along the way. But talk to peers at other companies, right? See what they're doing, see what's working and what's not working. Talk to your sort of, the people above you. I would have a constant conversation with my VP that basically was like, what should I be doing? What should I be focusing on? Not just my team and then like, but like me personally, like, what are things that I need to work on? And he would give me some pretty frank feedback, and that's great. It's great to say, we really need to do a better job showing the impact of our work across the organization. Awesome. I can do that. I can focus on that. Like, me personally, Brad, should be in more of these higher level conversations, like having that executive presence. Great. I can do that. Right. Like, that's really valuable feedback for you as a person. It's really good to talk to your peers, because you'll have a conversation like, oh yeah, I'm really struggling with this thing. And if you talk to 6 other people and they're like, oh, okay, great. I'm going to try 2 of those 6 things because maybe they'll work for me, maybe they won't. I think it's really important, regardless of what level you are, you need to sort of build relationships outside of your immediate bubble, your immediate circle. So like, if there's a peer mentorship program, sign up for that. If there are hackathons, participate in those. Set up informal coffee chats, right? Like, go to office hours, like, do these things that are going to not only get like your name and the research functions name out there, but it's really helpful for you to get these different perspectives, to learn from someone else's path and someone else's journey. I think that's how we do it.
Awesome. Super helpful. So we have just about 10 minutes left, everyone. So if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll catch up on a few questions here. So Maria was asking, back to the CIA, I think everyone loved the name. Did you receive any pushback when creating the CIA? If so, how did you handle that? And maybe also how you balanced this with your day-to-day role as well would be helpful to hear.
Yeah, I think at a high level, people were on board. They're like, yes, this makes sense. Of course, we should be on the same page. We struggled to get engagement from some of the teams at first. I don't want to name any names because we won't throw anyone under the bus. But yeah, some folks were busy or just maybe didn't necessarily see the value at first. And there's a few things you can do there. One, go talk to their leadership team and be like, hey, I'm really trying to work collaboratively with people here, and like this team, this individual is not not really engaging with us. Not like you're not trying to get them in trouble, just like, what should I do? Like, what is your advice, having worked with this person, understanding their constraints, their priorities? Like, what's the good tactic here? The other thing that I say all the time, I tell my team this all the time, especially in an operations world, you can't force people to do things. You can lead the horse to water, but you can't force it to drink, right? So instead of spending your energy trying to convince those people that aren't convinced, just move forward with the people that are, because what'll happen is that you'll start to gain momentum and show progress. And then these other people over here will be like, oh shit, we're missing out. Like, look at this cool thing that's happening. Look at this we published some really, really cool reports where it was like the data science team did some analysis, pulled something out of the piles of data that we have, and then we went and did the qual side. We were like, why is that happening? Let's go find out. Or we did some interviews. We came back, we're like, this is an interesting thing we saw. Like, can you pull something out of the data? We would work with our pricing team and say, great, here's what we saw for our audience of users. How does that compare to the rest of the industry? How do software engineers who use Auth0 compare to the rest of the software engineers? Like, there's a bunch of different ways you can combine your skill sets and just skill sets and the data that you have available. So when you start doing that and people start seeing the cool shit that you're doing, they're going to be like, oh, yeah, maybe we're missing out here.
Awesome. Very helpful advice. Cool. So there's another question here from Sarah on the stage of your org development and how that may change the research role itself. I think her context is that she's in a pre-launch organization, but I think just in general, how do you think about how the role of research evolves as an organization in general matures?
So I think it's very similar to, if you think about the entire like product or service delivery roadmap, like that life cycle. At the beginning, you don't have anything live, you don't have any customers. You got to do a bunch of discovery work. You got to figure out, okay, what is the problem space? How do people currently solve those problems, right? Like, yeah, okay, we've got an idea. We've identified 6 different problems we can solve. Okay, let's start to look at solutions. Which potential solutions to these problems are interesting? So you can go through that entire process for a product the same way you would for a company, right? If you're in that, having done a whole bunch of early stage startup work, I can tell you that we would do a research study and 2 weeks later they'd be like, nope, we're doing something else. Like, that does not even matter, which can be frustrating, but that's sort of part of the journey. That's part of the experience. Yeah, and if you are late stage, this is probably where most, in terms of volume, where most researchers are. If you're at a big tech company and you've got millions and billions of users and you're working on this tiny little piece of the product and you're trying to optimize whatever in your corner of this product, like, the type of research you do for that is very different, right? Like, we don't need to go do a bunch of discovery interviews if we know exactly what the problem is. We need to figure out a better way to solve that problem. So yeah, for your organization, if you are, I think some of the tactics will change depending on the maturity and the size of the company. That it's like, okay, and this is interesting. At 1010, we basically were a startup within 1010. We were this like little new team working on a different product, a different market. A similar experience with American Family Insurance, like corporate innovation. Guess what? AmFam is an enormous insurance company. What were we working on? Some satellite imagery stuff to like do property value assessment, or tools to make home ownership easier, right? Like, there were adjacencies obviously that we were working on, but like, that's not the core product. So the way that you operate in an organization, the size and the scale at which you work is going to depend on the company. But at the end of the day, like use the same technique and the same strategy you would working on a product as you would for the company. If you're early stage, focus on doing that discovery work, focus on the people that care about that discovery work. Your engineers probably, not to say that they don't care, but they probably care less about that type of stuff. If you're like, yeah, here's some problems people are facing, and the engineers will be like, great, what do you want us to do about it? Versus, hey, we're implementing this piece of software, we're building an API. Here are the things that people need to do. Like, here's the concrete. We've gone from having a bunch of conversations, doing a bunch of interviews, to breaking down the list, and here's the top 5 things that people want to do. Let's go build those.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Super tactical as well for organizations of any size. One more question just came up here from JD Buckley. How have you reconciled the improvements in the impact, visibility, and strategic approach of user research with the perception of potential threat to a product-led model? Example here being PM's own strategy.
I love this question because it's a very like nuanced. I don't want to call it a mature question, but this isn't just like, how do you work with PMs? In my experience, so certainly I can't speak to everyone and everything. At the end of the day, what a PM wants to do is deliver a successful product. How they get there, what it looks like, if they're doing their job properly, they don't care. They may have an idea of what it's going to be, and they may have their whole roadmap planned out in their vision. But if you're getting a strong signal that's like, hey, people, like, your vision does not line up with your market and your customers. If you're doing your job as a product person, you should be like, okay, I was wrong. This is fine. Like, let's figure out, maybe you do some reflecting and you meditate on why you were wrong and what how your vision was different from what your customers want. This is where you'll get people that are like, oh, well, Steve Jobs, the Henry Ford faster horse thing. It's like, yeah, you have that once in a while visionary type of thing, but still the part about the Steve Jobs, thing that people miss is that he literally put a block of wood in his pocket and walked around with it for months and pretended to like interact with this thing. Is that like really good user research? No. Did he just have an idea and then like, we're gonna make an iPhone? No, right? Like there's definitely a gap there. So yeah, I think that I would get this question from my team as well. Like, oh, well, we're trying to do some we're like enabling self-service research, and people can go do their own research. What happens if they don't check in with us? What happens if somebody, takes our templates, does a bunch of interviews, and then moves forward and makes a decision and gets it wrong? And I go, well, we have our guidelines, we have our process. This is what will happen at the postmortem, right? This is what will happen at the retrospective afterwards. They'll say, hey, what data were you using to make your decision? And the product person will say, we did a bunch of interviews. And leadership will say, great. Did you check with the research team? And the product person will say no. And at that point, it's like, well, we did everything that we can. We gave you the tools, we gave you the guidelines, we gave you, the existing data, we did what we can. If you're going to ignore all of that, if you're going to think that you're right and decide to go forward without, leveraging the capabilities we have, that's on you. And I can't force people to check in with us. There were 25 product teams at Auth0. There's one of me. There were 4 researchers. Like, we can't possibly cover all the ground that there is. So people need to take that responsibility themselves. So if you have a PM that's like, I think I'm right, and we're going to move forward without research, a lot of startups guess right enough and are successful enough. But those instances where they're not, and we saw this at Auth0, we launched features that afterwards it's like, nobody's buying this. So then they would go to research and go to pricing and say, why isn't anyone buying this? And we would do some research and come back and say, because no one wants it. No one asked us to build this. So then you as a company and you as a PM have to sort of cope with the fact that like, okay, did we do this just because we think it's like has longer term value and is producing, giving us a more well-rounded product, or did we mess up? Like, what are we going to do? Are we going to kill this thing? Are we going to eat the cost of it? But at a certain point, it's out of our hands, right? It's our job to do everything we can to support these folks and to give them the resources and give them the capabilities, but we don't make those decisions.
Totally. Well, appreciate the truth bombs and the great insight from your on the ground experience. I think this has been super insightful. The hour has flown by, and I see we have another final question here. Just want to be respectful of everyone's time, so maybe we can follow up with this in the recap and get your response later, Brad, to Lindsay's last question here. But yeah, thank you again for the time. This has been, again, super insightful, super helpful for folks, and thank you for helping us not only elevate the research practice within your own organization, but in general.
Yeah, it's been great. Thanks for having me. Thanks everyone for showing up. And yeah, we're looking forward to the follow-up. We'll get that wrap up out.
Perfect. Thank you. Bye, everyone.